Daniel sat frozen at his desk, papers trembling in his grip as though they carried the weight of his collapse. The numbers were drenched in red, every line screaming of betrayal. His hand shook as he whispered, "This can't be real." The storm outside clawed at the windows, lightning slicing across the skyline. Trust, once unshakable, had been torn apart. Richard, the partner he had treated like family, had siphoned their empire into hidden accounts, leaving Daniel staring into ruin. The office that once glowed with ambition now felt like a prison, its glass walls caging him with the truth. Betrayal was more than financial loss. It was a knife driven straight into the core of trust. He had built this dream brick by brick, and in one ruthless act, it had been stolen. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside his chest. Daniel rose from the chair and paced the floor like a man trapped between fury and despair. Each step echoed against glass walls, hollow reminders of a partnership that had collapsed. He remembered Richard's hand on his shoulder years ago, promising, "We'll conquer the market together." Those words now dripped venom, replaying as lies that mocked him in the storm's glow. He pressed his palms against the cold window, city lights smearing into streaks through rain. His company wasn't just business, it carried the weight of employees, clients, and family dreams. Every face seemed to demand answers he didn't have. The storm outside raged, yet it was the storm inside his chest that suffocated him. Betrayal was not only loss but the cruel theft of trust, a wound that made every victory they'd shared feel poisoned. His empire had turned into a hollow cage. Daniel dropped back into the chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. The desk before him looked less like a place of ambition, and more like an altar of betrayal, cluttered with evidence of theft. He thought of investors who had trusted him, employees who had followed his vision, family who had believed in his dream. Their faces hung over him like a silent jury. "Richard took everything," he muttered, his voice breaking under the storm's hum. Memories of meetings, handshakes, contracts, all of it collapsed into poisoned fragments. What they built had been a fortress, but Richard had hollowed its foundation until it cracked. The pain went deeper than loss of money. It was humiliation, personal ruin, and the shattering of everything that once gave him purpose. Daniel realized this wasn't just business, it was survival. Memories clawed at Daniel's mind, pulling him back to the beginning. He saw Richard's sharp smile across their first handshake, a smile he once mistook for confidence. He remembered long nights spent drafting plans, victories celebrated with laughter, dreams shared over drinks. Those moments now felt soured, every memory corroded by deceit. "You planned this," Daniel whispered, bitterness cutting his throat. Outside, lightning cracked across the skyline, echoing judgment. Betrayal was never sudden. It was seeded long ago, hidden beneath trust and watered in silence, until tonight's eruption. Their empire hadn't been stolen overnight. It had been drained slowly while Daniel's faith blinded him. Rage stirred beneath despair, a faint fire igniting in the ashes of collapse. Perhaps this was not his destruction, but the beginning of something darker and sharper. Rain softened outside, its steady rhythm replacing the earlier chaos. Daniel stood silent, but his chest carried the weight of betrayal like armor pressed too tightly. His thoughts turned to lives depending on him, employees, families, clients. Despair tempted him to surrender, but he clenched his jaw and whispered, "I won't let him destroy me." The words trembled yet carried a spark of defiance. The office no longer looked like a cage but a battlefield, its silence charged with intent. What Richard had taken cut deep, but what remained inside Daniel began to harden. He had been broken, but the fragments carried sharp edges, dangerous enough to fight back. The storm had stripped him bare, exposing loss and humiliation, yet beneath it all grew a determination stronger than fear. The fall had begun, but so had the resistance. Daniel's mind replayed the rise of his empire, from the cramped apartment where it began to the towering office, where he now stood betrayed. He had once believed sweat and sacrifice could build a fortress against failure. Those nights of ambition, fueled by caffeine and relentless drive, now felt like illusions. Richard had been there at every step, standing beside him like a brother, sharing victories and vowing loyalty. The betrayal burned sharper because of those memories. Daniel whispered, "We built this together and you cut me out." He stared at the Rain Street skyline, the city lights mocking him with their indifference. What once felt like triumph now tasted like ashes, and the foundation of his life's work crumbled under deceit. His story wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, and the cost of blind faith. He thought of the first deal they had closed, the small contract that felt like destiny. Richard's voice still echoed from that day. "This is the start of everything." The memory struck like glass shattering, because everything had been a lie. Daniel could see now how carefully Richard had masked his ambition. Every smile, every handshake, every toast had hidden calculation. Trust had blinded him, and ambition had made him deaf to warning signs. He pressed his fists into the desk, veins rising under his skin, anger competing with despair. "You waited until the ground was steady. Then you cut it from beneath me," he muttered. The storm outside had calmed, but inside him raged a tempest that could not be silenced. The empire was wounded, and he realized the wound came from within, inflicted by the man he had trusted most. The office phone sat in silence, a symbol of isolation. He imagined the calls from investors demanding answers, employees seeking reassurance, creditors circling like vultures. Fear pressed against his ribs, but beneath it, a spark flickered. He couldn't collapse, not yet. Lives depended on him, and surrender would mean leaving them to Richard's shadow. He whispered, "I'll fight this." The words were fragile, but they carried defiance. Memories of every sleepless night returned, a reminder of the sacrifices that had built this empire. Those sacrifices deserved more than surrender. He rose again, pacing with fists clenched, determination pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The storm outside had become a drizzle, but within him the storm grew sharper, transforming grief into resolve. He would not be a victim, not yet, not without a war. He moved to a cabinet in the corner and pulled open drawers, filled with old files and contracts. Each page felt heavier than the last, evidence of a dream turned weapon against him. He remembered laughter with Richard as they signed deals, celebrated milestones, and built trust brick by brick. But those bricks now formed a wall that trapped him, leaving him fighting shadows. He muttered, "You turned every step into a trap." His fingers brushed across photographs of their first office, younger faces full of hope. The contrast tore at him, showing how betrayal corrodes even the brightest past. Lightning was gone now, replaced by steady rain, its rhythm against the glass echoing like a slow drumbeat. The world had shifted, and Daniel stood among ruins disguised as memories, holding fragments that once defined his pride. Daniel sank to the floor, surrounded by scattered contracts and memories, his back pressed against the cold cabinet. The rain outside softened into a whisper, but the silence inside the office screamed louder. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths as he stared at the mess around him. He had been betrayed, stripped of more than money. He had lost faith in the one person he trusted most. Yet within that ruin, a decision formed. He whispered, "This isn't over." The words tasted like steel, a promise to himself. Pain carved his resolve, reshaping it into something unbreakable. The empire may have been gutted, but his fight was not. The storm had changed him, and though broken, he would rise sharper. Foundation may have been stolen, but the fire remained his. Morning crept into the city, but Daniel's office remained heavy with shadows. His eyes burned from a night without sleep, his mind circling the same torment. The betrayal wasn't just theft, it was sabotage, and the cracks in the empire widened with each hour. Calls began flooding in, messages from worried investors demanding clarity. He let the phone buzz on the desk, each vibration a reminder of pressure building around him. "How do I tell them everything they trusted was stolen?" he whispered. His reflection in the glass looked older, hardened overnight. He had lived through storms before, but this felt different. This wasn't the market turning against him, it was betrayal from within, a wound that could not be explained away. Fear gripped him, yet beneath it simmered determination. The fight had begun, and he knew the cost would be brutal. The first call he answered came from an investor whose voice carried both panic and accusation. "We trusted you, Daniel. What happened?" The words cut deep, sharper than numbers on a page. He tried to speak, but silence held him captive, shame pressing against his throat. Every promise he had made now felt like a chain. He clenched the receiver and finally said, "The truth isn't simple." His tone was steady, but inside he was fractured. He could feel the shift. The trust he once commanded had begun to dissolve. When the call ended, he stared at the desk, hearing the echo of disappointment long after the line went dead. Betrayal wasn't his alone. It was a shadow cast over everyone tied to him. And now he carried the weight of explaining a disaster he hadn't caused, but could not escape. Another call came, this time from his sidekick and closest ally, Michael. His voice was urgent. "Daniel, the staff are hearing rumors. You need to tell them something before panic spreads." Daniel closed his eyes, picturing the employees who had given everything to this company. Their livelihoods were intertwined with his dream, and now that dream teetered on collapse. "If they find out Richard gutted us, they'll think I let it happen," Daniel said quietly. Michael's voice cracked with frustration. "You have to stand up before he destroys you completely." Silence hung heavy after the call, the truth like a blade between them. Daniel knew Michael was right. Fear had to be replaced by resolve, because the longer he stayed silent, the more power Richard's betrayal carried. Survival depended on acting before the cracks became an avalanche. Daniel forced himself to the conference room, where the silence of empty chairs felt like judgment. He remembered the last time the room was full, when applause rang after landing their biggest contract. Now the emptiness stung. He imagined faces of his team, faces that once looked at him with belief. "I can't let them see me broken," he muttered, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. The betrayal threatened not only his company, but his identity as a leader. He looked at the presentation screen, blank and waiting, just as uncertain as his future. Richard's shadow lingered in every corner, mocking his hesitation. The storm had passed outside, but the air inside remained heavy with doubt. He had to decide whether to tell the truth or fight in silence. Either choice could shatter what little remained. The day wore on, each hour adding new cracks to the foundation. Messages piled, calls repeated, pressure closing in from every side. Daniel stood once more at the window, staring at the city that had once symbolized triumph, but now mirrored his collapse. He clenched his fists, whispering, "This won't be my end." The storm outside had left streets glistening, traffic crawling beneath gray skies. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like the man who once celebrated victories with Richard. It looked like someone forged from loss. Pain had carved him, but it also hardened him. The betrayal had stripped away illusions, leaving behind raw determination. For the first time since the collapse, he felt a surge of clarity. He was no longer just surviving betrayal, he was preparing for war. The silence in Daniel's office was broken by the buzz of an encrypted email that slipped into his inbox. His pulse quickened as he clicked it open, revealing documents he had never seen before. They showed shell companies, offshore accounts and transactions, all tied to Richard. The betrayal was deeper than theft. It was a calculated dismantling of everything they had built. "You planned this for years," Daniel whispered, fury sharpening his tone. The storm inside him shifted from grief to rage. Each page confirmed his worst fears. Richard had staged every success as a setup, preparing to gut him when the time was right. The realization made Daniel's hands tremble, not with weakness but with a dangerous clarity. Betrayal wasn't an accident. It was a masterpiece of deception, and now Daniel held the blueprint in his hands. Daniel pushed the laptop back, rising with unsteady steps. He moved toward the boardroom where glass walls reflected his fractured image. For the first time he saw Richard's betrayal not just as theft but as a war. "You wanted everything, but you left me with fire," he muttered. His reflection looked foreign, a man forged by loss and rage. The emptiness of the boardroom seemed to whisper reminders of Richard's manipulation. Handshakes, deals, and contracts all designed to trap him. Every betrayal felt like it was stitched into the very fabric of this room. Daniel realized the empire was never shared. It was always Richard's game, and he had been the pawn. But pawns could transform, and now the board felt different. He clenched his fists, a vow hardening in his chest. He wouldn't just survive, he would fight. Later that night, Michael arrived unannounced, his face drawn with concern. "Daniel, you need to see this," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were whistleblower reports from a former accountant who had documented Richard's schemes for months. The proof was undeniable. Richard had bled the company dry while preparing to take it over completely. Daniel's chest tightened as he flipped through the pages, each word igniting fury. Michael's voice shook. "He thinks you're finished, but this evidence could destroy him." For the first time, Daniel saw a weapon in his hands instead of wounds. The betrayal was no longer just a private torment. It was leverage. The room seemed brighter for a moment, lit not by stormlight, but by the spark of possibility. Daniel whispered, "This isn't just about me anymore, it's about justice." Daniel stood by the window, folder in hand, the city glowing beneath him. Richard had believed he would collapse, but now he had evidence strong enough to turn the tide. The skyline looked different tonight, not mocking but waiting. He imagined confronting Richard, not as a victim, but as a rival with power of his own. Thought filled him with a mix of fear and adrenaline. His empire was still in ruins, but the truth was now a weapon sharp enough to cut back. Michael's words echoed, "You can't hide anymore, Daniel. It's time to fight him on his ground." The betrayal had once hollowed him, but now it carved him into something harder, sharper, unyielding. Daniel's reflection in the glass no longer looked broken. It looked ready. Sleep never came that night. Daniel sat surrounded by evidence, his mind sharpening each detail into strategy. Every fraudulent account, every hidden deal was a blade he could turn against Richard. The pain was still there, but it fueled his resolve instead of drowning it. "You thought you ended me," he whispered, voice steady with defiance. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean under pale moonlight. The storm had passed, but a new one was forming within him, stronger than grief and sharper than fear. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was stolen. It was about exposing Richard for the fraud he was. The betrayal had shifted from wound to weapon, and Daniel was ready to strike. His downfall had been planned, but his comeback would be written by his own hand. Daniel entered the boardroom for the scheduled investor meeting, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in his hand. The room buzzed with tension, executives whispering as eyes turned toward him. At the far end sat Richard, calm and composed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You look tired, Daniel," Richard said smoothly, his voice echoing through the silence. Daniel didn't flinch. He opened the folder, sliding the damning documents across the polished table. Every page screamed of Richard's betrayal. Gasps filled the room. Whispers turned into shock. Richard's expression flickered, his mask cracking for the first time. "This ends tonight," Daniel said firmly, his voice steady with conviction. The confrontation he had dreaded was no longer a nightmare. It was a battlefield, and he refused to lose. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning as if nothing could touch him. "These papers mean nothing," he scoffed. His voice carried arrogance, but Daniel saw unease in his eyes. The executives flipped through the evidence, their faces paling as the truth unfolded. One asked, "Is this real?" Daniel's tone was sharp, unyielding. "Every number, every transfer, it's all him." The room buzzed with disbelief, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Richard tried to interrupt, raising his voice. "This is a setup." But his protest sounded hollow against the weight of proof. Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear but with vindication. The power balance had shifted, and for the first time since the betrayal, Richard no longer controlled the narrative. The confrontation escalated, voices clashing like thunder. Richard slammed a hand on the table, his composure breaking. "You think you can turn them against me?" he shouted, his mask slipping into rage. Daniel leaned forward, eyes blazing with defiance. "I don't have to turn them. You did that yourself." The silence that followed was crushing, the weight of truth undeniable. Executives avoided Richard's glare, their trust dissolving like smoke. Michael entered, placing more evidence on the table. A testimony from the whistleblower. The final blow landed, and Richard's confidence collapsed. Daniel's heart pounded, but his stance remained unshaken. This was the moment he had fought for, where betrayal met justice head-on. The boardroom erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as investors demanded answers. Richard tried to shout over them, but every attempt sounded weaker, stripped of authority. Daniel stood in the storm, calm at the center. He looked directly at Richard, speaking with steady resolve. "You built this empire on lies. I'll rebuild it with truth." His words echoed with finality, cutting through the noise. Richard's face twisted in fury, but his power had drained away. For years he had hidden behind charm and deception, but tonight the mask shattered. Daniel's body trembled with adrenaline, yet his spirit stood unbroken. The moment felt larger than business. It was justice, forged in the fire of betrayal. The shouting died, leaving only the sound of heavy breaths and rustling papers. Richard collapsed back into his chair, his arrogance stripped bare. Executives turned to Daniel, their expressions shifting from doubt to reluctant respect. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of victory pressing against the grief. He whispered, "It's over." The words carried both triumph and sorrow. The betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but in this moment, he stood taller than he ever had. Yet even as Richard sat defeated, Daniel knew the cost had been immeasurable. Trust shattered could never be restored, and scars would remain long after the battle. Still, he had survived, and survival itself felt like defiance. The boardroom emptied slowly, leaving Daniel standing alone with the echoes of voices still hanging in the air. The documents lay scattered across the polished table, silent witnesses to the battle that had just ended. For the first time, Richard was powerless, his shadow fading from the empire he tried to steal. Daniel exhaled deeply, the weight of survival pressing heavy on his chest. Victory felt hollow, carved from grief rather than triumph. The empire was still bleeding, but at least it was his again. He whispered, "We survived the storm, but the damage remains." His reflection in the glass no longer showed a broken man, but one marked by scars that would never fully heal. The battle had ended, yet the cost was written across every weary breath he drew. Back in his office, Daniel sat at the desk surrounded by silence. The laptop still glowed with damning evidence, yet it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a scar. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion carving lines across his face. Outside, the rain had cleared, leaving the city washed clean under pale light. "This doesn't feel like winning," he murmured, his voice hollow. Memories of trust broken and nights lost weighed heavier than any financial loss. The empire was intact, but the foundation of his faith had been shattered. He realized that rebuilding would not just mean numbers or contracts, it meant piecing together his own fractured trust. And that, he feared, would take far longer than fixing the books. Michael entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of Daniel, his expression lined with worry. "You stood tall today," he said softly. Daniel nodded, but kept his gaze fixed on the desk. "And lost more than I ever thought I could," he replied. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, the silence between them filled with unspoken truths. They both knew the empire could recover, but friendship and trust had been casualties no victory could restore. Daniel finally looked at him and said, "Richard may be gone, but the damage will never vanish." Michael's voice steadied, "Then let's rebuild, even if it takes years." The words offered no cure, but they planted a fragile seed of hope in the ashes of betrayal. Daniel walked through the nearly empty office floor, the hum of machines and flicker of lights filling the silence. Rows of desks stood as reminders of the people counting on him, their futures tethered to his choices. He paused, staring at framed photos of company milestones, moments once filled with pride. Now they felt heavier, reminders of both triumph and betrayal. He whispered to himself, "We'll rebuild, not for me, but for them." The weight of leadership settled over him like armor, heavy yet necessary. Each step across the floor felt like a vow, not of perfection but of persistence. The empire had been shaken to its core, but it would rise again, scarred yet unbroken. Later, Daniel stood once more at the tall glass windows, the city stretching endlessly below. The storm had long passed, replaced by calm night air. He placed a hand against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The empire would never be the same, and neither would he. Betrayal had taken more than wealth. It had carved scars into trust, loyalty, and faith. Yet, in that reflection, he saw resilience. He whispered, "This is not the end. It's the beginning of something harder, but stronger." The city lights blinked like silent witnesses, indifferent, yet constant. Daniel knew the road ahead was uncertain, but he no longer felt hollow. He felt scarred, tempered, and alive with the will to rise again. The morning sun broke through the skyline, casting long shadows across Daniel's office. The city felt alive again, but inside the glass walls silence reigned. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the scattered evidence one last time. The storm was over, the truth revealed, yet the scars remained. He whispered, "It's strange how victory can feel like loss." His empire had been saved, but not without a cost written in betrayal. Every achievement now carried the echo of Richard's deceit. Still, survival itself was a triumph. Daniel closed the folder and pushed it away, a symbolic act of letting go. The weight on his shoulders didn't vanish, but it lightened, replaced by resolve. For the first time in weeks, he felt the dawn was his, not Richard's. Daniel stepped into the open office floor, walking slowly past the rows of desks. Employees began arriving, their eyes filled with uncertainty and quiet questions. He felt their stares like a silent jury, waiting to see if their leader was still standing. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice steady though soft. Heads lifted, eyes met his with cautious hope. Trust would not return overnight, but his presence was a promise that he had not abandoned them. Every step across the floor carried the weight of leadership, not as authority but as responsibility. The betrayal had fractured the foundation, yet here he was, carrying the fragments forward. The company was scarred, but so long as he breathed, it would not fall. Later that day, Daniel met with Michael in the small conference room. The weight of exhaustion still clung to him, but his eyes carried fire. Michael placed a report on the table, outlining a plan to stabilize the company. "It's not perfect, but it's a start," he said. Daniel nodded, scanning the pages, the words blurring slightly through fatigue. "Then we'll start here," he replied, his voice calm but resolved. Michael leaned forward, his tone firm. "You're not alone in this anymore." For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe it. Betrayal had taught him pain, but it also revealed loyalty that could not be broken. Together, they would face what lay ahead. The path was uncertain, but not empty. As night fell again, Daniel stood outside the building, gazing up at the skyscraper that had nearly become his tomb. The glass tower glistened against the city lights, no longer mocking but standing as a reminder of resilience. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, the smoke curling into the cool air. "You tried to bury me, Richard," he murmured, "but I'm still here." The city hummed around him, indifferent yet alive. The betrayal would always haunt him, but it no longer owned him. He had endured the storm, faced his enemy, and survived. The scars would never fade, but neither would his resolve. Tonight, the empire still stood, and so did he. Back in his office, Daniel returned to the window one final time. The city stretched endlessly, lights glowing like stars scattered across the earth. He pressed a hand to the glass, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the reflection wasn't the same one who had once trusted blindly, celebrated recklessly, and believed loyalty was unbreakable. This man was scarred, hardened, but alive. He whispered, "This is just the beginning." The words carried both grief and hope, an acknowledgement of the past and a vow for the future. Silence filled the room, not heavy but calm, as though the storm had finally ended. The empire would rise again, not untouched but stronger, built on lessons carved in betrayal.